This is a painting of an Iowa farmer and his wife. It was painted by an Iowa man named Grant Wood. Maybe his tongue was in his cheek a little, but there's a feel of Iowa to it. A taste of the land. Iowa's a lot of things and a lot of towns and people. But from one town to the next, the flat black Iowa earth reaches out fertile and rich, and towns sit in between. The modern towns scattered across the prairie tableland between the Mississippi and Missouri. The Iowa, out where the tall corn grows.
During the height of World War II, some 16 million Americans went off to serve in the United States Armed Forces. Men of fighting age were overseas fighting a war on two fronts. Women were working in munitions plants, factories, or serving in their own ways. The entire country was behind the war effort. Daily items were rationed, and much of what America produced went to the fighting men overseas. In many cases, the family farms were the hardest hit, sending their sons off to Europe and the Pacific and leaving the farm to go unattended.
The farm's not small, and 44 has been a tough year in Iowa. It's been tough for Scott, with his oldest boy hurrying off into the Navy the day he hit 18. And it's been tough for him to keep Scott Jr. going off to school every day with so much help needed and no place to find it.
For generations, Iowa has been home of family-run farms that feed America. But during World War II, these farms were hit hard. There was a labor shortage, and many small businesses could not keep up.
There used to be an Iowa saying about hogs, about feeding the hogs to make pork for your kids, so your kids come up healthy enough to grow corn to feed the hogs. Only in 1944, 1 out of every 4 hogs goes to war as pork or ham or spam.
England had begun taking German soldiers prisoner in North Africa as early as 1941. But they didn't have the room or resources to care for them. So in 1942, the British asked the United States to take over care for some of the prisoners of war. The United States began building camps, more than 500 in total, that would come to house more than 400,000 prisoners of war across America.
But it really didn't strike home with people until they began to see some of the German prisoners that marched from one of our train stations in Algona out to the camp in April of 1944. Then they realized this is for real.
Shortly thereafter, an idea was hatched. As part of the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were allowed to be given the opportunity to work and earn a fair wage. As the wartime labor shortage intensified across America, farmers turned to an unexpected source for replacement farmhands: captured German soldiers.
My father, who was a farmer, came to Algona to pick up these prisoners, and we became quite acquainted with 4 of them. There was 4 that would come out plus a guard, and the guard would sit under the shade tree in our front yard, because I was 12 years old at the time, and I thought that was very exciting to have a guard with his gun sitting in our front yard.
In Iowa, the 2 main camps were in Algona and Clarinda, with 34 branch camps spread across 4 states. The creation of these camps started an economic boost almost immediately. Construction workers and other trade laborers were needed to build these many towns. In addition, food, gas, electric, water, and other supplies were needed to maintain the camp.
When the prisoners were taken to work for farmers in the different areas, that was a great help to the farmer. They were able to get the crops in or plant the crops that needed to be done.
The kind of work that the POWs performed was as varied as the communities in which they were held. They served farmers, worked in canneries, nurseries, and milk processing plants. They detasseled hybrid corn for DeKalb and Pioneer in Humboldt and Algona. They cut timber and pulpwood in northern Minnesota. They worked in brick and tile factories, did silo construction. Any place that could be deemed minimal security risk, they found work.
Well, my husband's brother Henry, he had one group of men that cut trees, and they came up to our place at noon and sat under a big tree out in our front yard. And I don't know, they were quite nice people. They were quiet, and they sometimes you could hear them talk, but they were talking German. You couldn't always understand them, even though I can understand German, but I can't talk it. And there was one day they forgot their coffee, and I had to cook coffee for them. They were so grateful for that. Otherwise, they'd have had to drink water with their meal.
Wir sind des Geiers schwarzer Haufen, und wollen mit Tyrannen raufen.
Even though the Germans were far from home, the Iowa landscape was not that much different than what they were used to in Germany. Some farmers of German descent were able to speak their language. They were treated fairly and respectfully. However, when they were offered sweet corn, the prisoners had an interesting reaction.
They were given corn to eat. That's a good staple crop, particularly in the summertime, and that was something they weren't used to because in their own country of Germany, corn was fed to the hogs, and so they were a little reluctant to eat the corn. Some adjustments then were made in the menus, and overall these menus then had to comply with the number of calories that the prisoners were expected to receive, and this matched up then with the number of calories that would be available for the American military as well.
It was often misinterpreted that the camps were for Nazis, and intentionally allowing Nazis to live in America had a lot of people talking. In fact, many of the POWs were simply German citizens serving their country.
Once they saw these German soldiers, they recognized they look a lot like us, and they really didn't look like Nazis. As a matter of fact, they weren't. They were members of the Wehrmacht, and they were going to be here for the duration of the war, or at least prisoners in the U.S. for the duration of the war. And they were going to be working to help improve our economy.
If flight risk was a concern, the German POWs were easily identified by their uniforms. They wore outdated American military uniforms with a P and W stamped in large letters on them. Also, one of the good things about being in Iowa was there really was not any place for them to escape to.
The escapes from the camp were maybe as much curiosity as there were anything else. In some of the camps down in the southern part of the United States, where they were closer to the international border with Texas, there were some escapes where they're actually trying to, get out of the country. But where are they going to go here? It's 1,000 miles either to the Gulf of Mexico or Canada. And so getting out and escaping was just more of a chance to see if they could get it done rather than anything else.
Many of the prisoners became regulars at the farm. Some families even invited them to eat lunch with them.
And then at noon, my dad would go out and pick them up in the field and come in, and they would sit down and eat at our dining room table along with us. This was a must at our house. Whoever came was invited to stay and eat. And it was a very natural, normal thing for our family to include them in the big meals that my mother would prepare. And this same four wanted to keep coming back as they loved my mother's cooking. And she would prepare a large meal. Potatoes, gravy, vegetables, dessert, meat.
As POWs continued to work on the farm, they developed relationships with their farming host family. At the end of the war, men came home and the POWs were sent back overseas. However, when they got back home and saw the destruction of their war-torn homeland, some longed for the cornfields of Iowa and asked to return to apply to become American citizens.
They saw what the real America was, and they recognized that if you worked hard, these opportunities might pay off for you.
Algona housed nearly 10,000 prisoners between 1943 and 1946. By the end of the war, it was estimated that Camp Algona and its branch camps added $3.5 million back into the local economy.
Now there's your story of Iowa, boys.
That's a story of Iowa, Scott. It's a little story inside a bigger story. Because there's washing machine plants and button factories and slaughterhouses in that big state of yours sitting out there beside the Mississippi. Just as much Iowa as the black earth rolling sidewise under the power harrows and the plows. But the drone of tractors cutting back the Iowa soil for seed at 5 a.m. is what's most of Iowa as they cut the long, straight furrows for their corn.